The surgical lights blazed down on Michael Thompson's unconscious form as Dr. Jennifer Wilson stepped back from the operating table, her gloved hands trembling. In 30 years of practicing medicine, she had never seen anything like what lay before her. "Get me another unit of blood," she called to the nurse, her voice tight with controlled panic. "And call the family back. They need to know." The thing they had just removed from Michael's back defied explanation. What had appeared to be a simple, infected cyst had concealed something far more sinister and miraculous. Metal fragments, decades old, intertwined with tissue in a pattern that should have killed him years ago. In the waiting room, Sarah Thompson clutched her 16-year-old son, Jake's hand, while her mother-in-law Martha whispered prayers. They had no idea that the lump Michael had ignored for months was about to reveal a family secret that would change everything they thought they knew about sacrifice, survival, and the true cost of war. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, the Thompson farm stretched across 200 acres of Kansas heartland, its golden cornfields swaying beneath an endless summer sky. The weathered farmhouse had sheltered 3 generations of Thompsons, each adding their own scars and stories to its foundation. An American flag hung proudly from the front porch where Michael Thompson sat every evening, watching the sun disappear behind his grandfather's barn. Michael was 52, built like the oak trees that bordered his property, solid, weathered, and stubborn as the day was long. His calloused hands told the story of a man who believed in hard work and self-reliance, values passed down from his father, a Vietnam veteran who had died when Michael was barely 20. Those same hands now trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking, a tremor he attributed to too much coffee and not enough sleep. Sarah Thompson moved through their kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had learned to stretch every dollar and make every meal count. At 49, she retained the gentle strength that had first attracted Michael 26 years ago, though worry lines now creased her forehead more deeply than laugh lines. She had been a registered nurse before Jake was born, a fact that had become both a blessing and a source of tension in their household. Her medical knowledge made her hypersensitive to Michael's habit of ignoring his body's warning signs. Their son Jake embodied the best of both parents, his father's determination wrapped in his mother's compassion. At 16, he stood 6 feet tall and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a young man who understood responsibility. The star of his high school football team, Jake had already received interest from several colleges, though the family's financial situation made those dreams feel increasingly distant. Martha Thompson, Michael's 78-year-old mother, lived in the small apartment they had built onto the farmhouse 5 years earlier. She moved slowly but with purpose, her silver hair always perfectly arranged, her eyes holding secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. She had a habit of stopping mid-conversation, staring at old photographs and muttering things like, "Some burdens skip generations," or "The past has a way of catching up." The farm itself bore the weight of recent struggles. 2 years of drought had devastated their corn yield, and rising medical costs from Martha's heart medication had drained their savings. The mortgage payments had become irregular, and Michael spent sleepless nights at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to make numbers add up that simply wouldn't cooperate. Despite their financial worries, the Thompsons remained pillars of their small community. They attended Grace Lutheran Church every Sunday, hosted the annual Harvest Festival, and never let neighbors go without help during tough times. Michael served on the school board, Sarah volunteered at the food bank, and Jake tutored younger students. They lived by the old-fashioned belief that character was measured not by what you had, but by what you gave when you had nothing left to give. This was the world Michael Thompson knew, predictable, grounded in tradition, and built on the foundation that a man could handle whatever life threw at him if he just worked hard enough and kept his mouth shut about his troubles. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the first hints of autumn had begun to paint the maple trees around the Thompson farmhouse. Michael had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to check on the livestock before the day's harvest. The shower afterward was routine until his hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. The lump sat just below his right shoulder blade, roughly the size of a golf ball, firm and unmistakably foreign beneath his weathered skin. Michael's first instinct was denial. He pressed against it experimentally, wincing at the tender sensation that radiated outward. Probably just a pulled muscle from yesterday's hay baling, he told himself. Maybe a cyst. Nothing that wouldn't resolve itself with time and ibuprofen. He toweled off quickly, avoiding the bathroom mirror that might force him to confront what he'd found. The house was still quiet. Sarah wouldn't be up for another hour, and Jake was dead to the world until his alarm went off at 7. Michael dressed carefully, choosing a shirt that wouldn't reveal the slight asymmetry the lump created across his back. For 3 days, he managed to keep his discovery secret. He modified his movements subtly, avoiding the reaching and twisting motions that caused the sharpest discomfort. When Sarah absently ran her hand across his back while passing behind his chair at dinner, he fought the urge to flinch away from her touch. But Sarah Thompson hadn't been a nurse for 15 years without developing an eye for the subtle signs of pain. She noticed how Michael favored his left side when climbing into the truck. She saw him pause before lifting heavy feed sacks, his jaw tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the weight. Most tellingly, she observed how he'd stopped joining her in their evening ritual of sitting on the porch swing, claiming he preferred the kitchen chair these days. The confrontation came on Friday evening. Michael was attempting to adjust the antenna on their old television when Sarah walked up behind him and placed her palm squarely on the lump. "How long have you been hiding this from me?" she asked, her voice carrying the controlled calm that meant serious trouble. Michael's shoulders sagged. There was no point in denying what she could feel with her own hands. "It's nothing, Sarah. Just a cyst or something. You know how these things go." "No, Michael, I don't know how these things go because my husband usually tells me when he finds mysterious lumps on his body." Her fingers moved expertly around the mass, her nurse's training taking over. "This is substantial. And it's warm. When did you first notice it?" "Tuesday," he admitted, unable to meet her eyes. "Tuesday? You been walking around for 4 days with this thing and didn't think to mention it?" Sarah's voice climbed higher. "Michael, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This needs to be examined by a doctor. Today." "It's Friday evening, Sarah. Doctors' offices are closed. Then we'll go to the emergency room." "We're not going to the emergency room for a cyst." Michael's voice carried the finality that usually ended their disagreements, but Sarah wasn't backing down. "You don't know it's a cyst. You don't know what it is. That's why we need a professional opinion." Jake appeared in the doorway, drawn by their raised voices. At 16, he'd learned to read the temperature of his parents' relationship with the skill of a meteorologist. "What's going on?" "Your father has a medical issue he's been hiding," Sarah said, her eyes never leaving Michael's face. "And he's refusing to get it checked out." "Dad?" Jake's voice carried a note of worry that cut straight through Michael's defenses. "It's nothing for you to worry about, son. Just your mother overreacting to a minor problem." "Overreacting." Sarah's control finally cracked. "Michael Thompson. My father died because he was too proud to see a doctor about chest pains he thought were just indigestion. I will not watch you make the same stupid, stubborn mistake." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of Martha's antique clock on the wall. Jake looked between his parents, understanding that this fight was about more than just a lump. It was about trust, about fear, about all the things his father refused to say out loud. "The emergency room will cost us $1,500 just to walk through the door," Michael said finally. "We don't have insurance coverage for that kind of expense." "Then we'll figure out the money," Sarah replied. "We'll take out a loan. We'll ask the bank for an extension. We'll do whatever we have to do, but we're not ignoring this." Michael turned away from them both, staring out the kitchen window at the fields he'd worked his entire adult life. His father's words echoed in his memory. "A man handles his own problems, Michael. He doesn't go running to others every time something hurts." But looking at his son's worried face, Michael wondered for the first time if his father had been wrong about more than just that one thing. 3 weeks passed in a tense stalemate. Michael continued working the farm with grim determination, while the lump beneath his shoulder blade grew from golf ball to tennis ball size. Sarah watched him with the intensity of a hawk, noting every wince, every careful movement, every night he spent tossing restlessly beside her. The silence between them had grown thick and poisonous, broken only by necessary conversations about farm business and Jake's school activities. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon during the corn harvest. Michael was operating the combine harvester, a massive machine that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. The October sun beat down mercilessly as he guided the mechanical beast through row after row of golden stalks. The vibration from the engine sent constant jolts of pain through his back, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The harvest couldn't wait for his comfort. Jake was supposed to be in school, but he'd started skipping classes to help with the farm work. He ran alongside the harvester, clearing debris from the cutting header when it became clogged. Sarah had driven out to the fields with water and sandwiches, though her real purpose was to check on Michael's condition. It was Jake who saw his father's head slump forward first. The 17-year-old boy watched in horror as the combine veered off course, heading straight toward the irrigation ditch that bordered their property. "Dad!" he screamed, sprinting after the runaway machine. Michael had lost consciousness completely. The pain that had been building for weeks finally overwhelmed his system, and his body simply shut down. The combine's engine roared as it crashed through the wooden fence posts, coming to rest with its front wheels in the shallow ditch. Sarah reached the scene first, her nursing instincts overriding her panic. She found Michael slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious but breathing. His skin was pale and clammy, his pulse rapid but weak. Jake stood beside the machine, his face white with terror. "Call 911, Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Tell them we need an ambulance at Thompson Farm, Highway 47. Unconscious, adult male, possible medical emergency." While Jake fumbled with his cell phone, Sarah carefully extracted Michael from the harvester's cab. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and when she placed her hand on his back, she could feel the heat radiating from the infected lump. It had more than doubled in size since she'd last examined it, and the skin around it was red and inflamed. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later, though it felt like hours to Sarah. The paramedics were professionals she recognized from her nursing days at Mercy General. They took one look at Michael's condition and began preparing him for transport immediately. "Mrs. Thompson, we need to get him to the hospital right away," the lead paramedic explained as they loaded Michael onto a stretcher. "His vital signs are unstable, and that mass on his back appears to be severely infected. This could be sepsis." The ride to Mercy General Hospital became a nightmare of sirens and medical terminology that Sarah understood all too well. Sepsis meant Michael's body was fighting a system-wide infection, and if they couldn't control it quickly, organ failure would follow. She held his hand in the ambulance, whispering prayers and promises that everything would be okay, even as she feared it might not be. Dr. Jennifer Wilson met them in the emergency department. Sarah knew her by reputation, a competent surgeon who had moved to their rural hospital from Kansas City 5 years earlier. "Doctor, Wilson took one look at the infected mass and immediately ordered blood work, CT scans, and IV antibiotics. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you some difficult questions," Dr. Wilson said, pulling Sarah aside while nurses worked on Michael. "How long has your husband had this mass?" "At least 3 weeks that I know of. Probably longer. He's been hiding it from me." "Has he had any recent injuries? Any surgeries in the past? Any foreign travel?" Sarah shook her head to each question, then paused. "His father served in Vietnam. Michael was born in 1972 after his father returned from the war. Could that be relevant?" Dr. Wilson's expression shifted slightly. "Possibly. We're going to need to do some imaging to see what we're dealing with. This mass is unlike anything I've seen in general practice. There appears to be something solid at its center." The CT scan results came back 2 hours later, and Dr. Wilson's face was grave when she returned to the family consultation room where Sarah, Jake, and Martha waited. She carried a tablet displaying the scan images. "I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Wilson began. "Your husband has what appears to be foreign objects embedded in the muscle tissue of his back. The infection has formed around these objects, creating the mass you've observed. We need to operate immediately to remove both the infected tissue and whatever is causing this reaction." "Foreign objects?" Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of foreign objects?" "From the imaging, they appear to be metallic. Small fragments, deeply embedded. Mrs. Thompson, does your husband have any history of military service? Any industrial accidents involving metal debris?" Martha Thompson, who had been silent throughout the crisis, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was barely audible, trembling with decades of suppressed guilt. "It's not Michael's military service," she said. "It's his father's." All eyes turned to the elderly woman. Jake moved closer to his grandmother, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "What do you mean, Grandma?" "Your grandfather came back from Vietnam with shrapnel in his body," Martha continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The doctors said they got most of it out, but some pieces were too dangerous to remove. They said it would work its way out naturally or stay put and cause no problems." She paused, struggling with words she'd kept locked away for nearly 50 years. "But it didn't stay put. And when Michael was born—" Dr. Wilson leaned forward intently. "Mrs. Thompson, are you saying this shrapnel was somehow passed to your son?" "The doctor said it was impossible," Martha sobbed. "But Michael was born with small metal fragments already in his tissue." "They said it must have been some kind of freak accident during birth, that instruments had somehow contaminated the delivery. But I knew it was his father's war coming home to claim another generation." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah stared at her mother-in-law, processing the implications of what she'd just heard. Jake looked confused and frightened, trying to understand how his grandfather's war could still be hurting his father 50 years later. Dr. Wilson was the first to recover her composure. "Regardless of how these fragments got there, we need to remove them now. The infection is severe, and it's spreading. Mrs. Thompson, I need you to sign consent forms for emergency surgery. We'll be operating within the hour." As Sarah signed the papers that would either save her husband's life or confirm her worst fears, she couldn't help but think about the cruel irony of it all. Michael's father had survived Vietnam only to pass his hidden wounds to his son like some terrible inheritance that waited decades to collect its due. The weeks following Michael's emergency surgery blurred together in a haze of hospital visits, mounting medical bills, and desperate attempts to keep the farm running. Sarah had taken indefinite leave from her part-time job at the local pharmacy to split her time between Michael's bedside and managing the harvest that couldn't wait for anyone's convenience. Jake had effectively dropped out of school, though his teachers turned a blind eye to his absences, understanding that sometimes family crises trumped algebra and American history. The surgery had been successful in removing the infected tissue and extracting 3 pieces of shrapnel that had been slowly migrating through Michael's back muscles for over 50 years. Dr. Wilson had shown them the fragments afterward, twisted bits of metal no larger than pencil erasers, darkened with age and encased in scar tissue. It seemed impossible that such small objects could cause such devastation, but the infection they'd triggered had nearly killed him. Michael's recovery was slow and complicated. The infection had damaged more tissue than initially apparent, requiring a second surgery to clean out additional affected areas. He spent 2 weeks in intensive care, another week in regular recovery, and came home with a drainage tube, strict antibiotic regimen, and orders for complete bed rest. For a man who had never spent a full day in bed, except when flu-ridden, the forced inactivity was almost as torturous as the physical pain. The financial implications of his illness began revealing themselves like layers of an onion, each one making Sarah's eyes water more than the last. The emergency room visit alone had cost $4,200. The first surgery was $18,000. The second surgery added another $12,000. The 2-week hospital stay with its daily charges for room, nursing care, medications, and monitoring equipment brought their total to just over $47,000. Their health insurance, a bare-bones catastrophic policy that Michael had purchased to satisfy legal requirements rather than provide meaningful coverage, paid exactly $3,200 of these expenses. The rest became the Thompson family's responsibility, payable immediately or subject to collection agencies that began calling within weeks of Michael's discharge. Sarah found herself in the surreal position of negotiating payment plans while her husband's surgical wounds were still healing. The hospital's financial counselor, a kind but overwhelmed woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, explained their options with the practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news several times daily. "Your best bet is to apply for hardship assistance," she explained during one of their meetings. "You'll need to provide 3 years of tax returns, bank statements, proof of all current debts, and documentation of your husband's inability to work. The committee meets once monthly to review applications." "And if we're denied?" Sarah asked. "Then we set up a payment plan based on your ability to pay. The minimum would be around $800 per month." Sarah had stared at the woman across the desk, wondering if she understood that $800 represented nearly half of their monthly income, even when Michael was working. With the harvest incomplete and medical expenses mounting, they were already borrowing against next year's crop just to keep the lights on. Jake had witnessed this conversation from the hallway outside Mrs. Rodriguez's office, having driven his mother to the hospital for the meeting. At 17, he was learning harsh lessons about adult responsibilities that his classmates wouldn't face for years. The football scholarship offers that had seemed so promising in September were becoming distant dreams as his grades suffered from chronic absence and his playing time diminished due to missed practices. The community response had been both heartwarming and humbling. Grace Lutheran Church had organized a benefit dinner that raised $3,400. The local VFW Post, learning about the Vietnam connection through Martha's reluctant sharing of family history, contributed $2,800 from their emergency assistance fund. Jake's football team held a car wash that brought in another $650. Individual neighbors stopped by with casseroles, offers to help with chores, and envelopes containing $20 or $50 bills that represented real sacrifice from families facing their own economic pressures. But even these generous contributions barely made a dent in their mounting debts. The second mortgage they'd taken on the farm the previous year was already 3 months behind. The bank had been patient initially, but patience had limits when secured by land that might need to be liquidated to recover losses. Martha Thompson watched her family's financial destruction with the particular agony of someone who felt responsible for events set in motion decades before her grandson's birth. She had begun selling her jewelry, starting with pieces that held sentimental value but no immediate practical purpose. Her wedding ring, which she'd worn for 56 years until her husband's death, went to a pawn shop in the county seat for $340. A pearl necklace that had been her mother's brought $180. Her engagement ring, the last connection to the man who'd returned from Vietnam, changed and haunted, sold for $420. These sales bought groceries and kept the electricity connected, but they also represented the systematic dismantling of a family's history in service of present survival. Each transaction felt like a small betrayal of memory, though Martha knew her deceased husband would have approved. He'd always been practical about possessions, having learned in war that anything you couldn't carry might be lost without warning. The mystery of how shrapnel from Michael's father had ended up in Michael's body had consumed Martha's thoughts during the long hours she spent alone while Sarah was at the hospital and Jake was trying to manage the farm. She'd finally forced herself to retrieve a box of military documents from her bedroom closet, papers she'd avoided looking at for over 20 years. Among her husband's discharge papers and medical records, she found references to retained foreign material and notes about fragments too close to vital structures for safe removal. One doctor's note, dated 3 months before Michael's birth, mentioned that remaining shrapnel appears to be slowly migrating and recommended regular monitoring for changes in position or symptoms. But the most devastating discovery was a letter her husband had written to their unborn child, sealed in an envelope marked "For my son or daughter when they're old enough to understand." Martha had never known the letter existed. With trembling hands, she'd opened it to find her husband's familiar handwriting covering 3 pages of military-issued stationery. The letter explained his fears about the war's lasting effects on his family. He wrote about nightmares that wouldn't stop, about anger that erupted without warning, about the constant pain from shrapnel that doctors couldn't safely remove. Most heartbreakingly, he'd expressed concern that the war had somehow changed him at a cellular level, that he might pass on damage he couldn't see or understand. "I pray every day that this baby will be born clean and whole," he'd written. "I pray that my war won't become his war, that the metal in my body won't somehow find its way into his. But if it does, I want him to know that he's stronger than I am. I want him to know that some battles are worth fighting, and some victories take generations to achieve." Martha had wept over that letter for hours, finally understanding that her husband's fears had been both irrational and prophetic. The shrapnel hadn't somehow magically transferred from father to son, but its presence in their lives had created a legacy of silence and shame that had nearly killed Michael 50 years later. Sarah discovered her mother-in-law crying over the letter when she returned from another fruitless meeting with insurance representatives. The 2 women had never been particularly close. Martha had always felt that Sarah was too educated, too questioning of traditional roles, but grief and fear had a way of dissolving old resentments. "I should have told him about this years ago," Martha sobbed, clutching the letter. "If he'd known about his father's pain, maybe he wouldn't have been so stubborn about his own." Sarah read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. The tragedy wasn't just medical, it was generational. Michael's father had carried the physical and emotional wounds of war in silence, modeling for his son that real men endured pain without complaint. That lesson had nearly killed Michael and was now threatening to destroy everything they'd built together. The insurance battle intensified when Sarah discovered that their policy contained a clause excluding coverage for hereditary conditions, The company's lawyers argued that since Michael had been born with the shrapnel, his condition was genetic rather than accidental and therefore not covered under their plan. Sarah had laughed bitterly when the insurance adjuster explained this interpretation over the phone. "You're telling me that my husband's war injuries aren't covered because he inherited them from his father's war injuries?" "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Thompson, but our medical reviewers have determined that this condition was present at birth, making it a pre-existing hereditary condition under the terms of your policy." The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if their financial survival hadn't depended on overturning this decision. Sarah spent hours on the phone with insurance representatives, patient advocates, and eventually lawyers who specialized in insurance disputes. Each conversation cost time she didn't have and money they couldn't spare, but the alternative was accepting financial ruin. Jake's response to his family's crisis had surprised everyone, particularly himself. The boy who had always been content to let adults handle adult problems suddenly found himself thrust into roles that required maturity beyond his years. He negotiated with grain buyers for the best prices on their partial harvest. He researched agricultural loans and grant programs. He even drove to neighboring farms to hire himself out for weekend work, bringing home $50 or $75 that felt like fortunes given their circumstances. Most significantly, Jake had begun visiting his father daily, bringing homework to do at Michael's bedside. During these visits, they talked more honestly than they ever had before. Michael, weakened by surgery and humbled by his family's sacrifices, found himself sharing stories about his own childhood, his fears about the farm's future, and his regrets about waiting so long to seek medical care. "I thought I was protecting you all by staying strong," Michael admitted during one of these conversations. "I thought admitting I needed help would make me less of a man, less of a father." Jake had looked up from his history textbook, studying his father's gaunt face. "Dad, you know what I think makes someone a man?" "What's that, son?" "Doing whatever it takes to be there for your family, even if it scares you, even if it hurts your pride." These words, spoken by a 17-year-old who was learning to be an adult before he'd finished being a child, hit Michael harder than any of his physical pain. He realized that his stubborn independence hadn't protected his family. It had nearly destroyed them. The crisis reached its peak on a gray November morning when two uniformed men arrived at the Thompson farm carrying official documents and grim expressions. Sarah answered the door to find a sheriff's deputy and a bank representative standing on her porch, their breath visible in the cold air. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Deputy Martinez, and this is Mr. Coleman from First National Bank. We're here to serve notice of foreclosure proceedings on this property." Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the papers. She'd known this moment was coming. They were now 5 months behind on their mortgage payments. But seeing the official language of legal seizure made it terrifyingly real. The bank was claiming the right to auction their farm in 30 days unless they could produce $47,000 in back payments plus penalties. "Is there anything we can do?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. They'd exhausted every option, applied for every hardship program, and borrowed against everything they owned. Mr. Coleman, a thin man in his 50s who looked genuinely uncomfortable with his task, cleared his throat. "The bank has been more than patient, Mrs. Thompson. We understand your husband's medical situation, but we have obligations to our other depositors. If you can secure the full amount by December 15th, we can halt the proceedings." After the men left, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and stared at the foreclosure notice until the words blurred together. 3 generations of Thompson history would be sold to the highest bidder to pay for medical bills that had resulted from a war that ended before she was born. The irony felt cosmic in its cruelty. Michael was in the barn when she found him, attempting to repair a broken hay baler despite doctor's orders to avoid heavy lifting. His surgical scars were still tender, and she could see him favoring his left side as he worked. The sight of him trying to maintain normalcy while their world collapsed around them broke something loose in her chest. "They came with foreclosure papers," she said without preamble. Michael's hands stilled on the wrench he'd been holding. He didn't turn around immediately, and when he did, his face carried the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news but hoping to delay it a little longer. "How long do we have?" 30 days, unless we can come up with $47,000. They stood in the barn's dusty silence, surrounded by equipment that had belonged to Michael's father and grandfather, tools that would soon belong to strangers. A red-winged blackbird called from the rafters, the sound incongruously cheerful given the circumstances. "I've been thinking," Michael said finally. "Maybe it's time to consider other options." "What kind of options?" "Bankruptcy. Starting over somewhere else. I could get a job in town. You could go back to nursing full-time. Jake's smart. He'll get scholarships for college." Sarah studied her husband's face, recognizing the particular set of his jaw that meant he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Michael Thompson, in 52 years of life, have you ever run from a fight?" "This isn't about running. This is about being realistic." "No, this is about giving up. And that's not who you are." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching the farmhouse. Through the barn's open door, they could see a caravan of pickup trucks and cars pulling into their driveway. Sarah recognized several neighbors, members of their church, and Jake's football coach among the group climbing out of vehicles. Pastor Williams, a soft-spoken man who'd baptized Jake and officiated at Martha's recent 80th birthday celebration, approached them carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone who'd come bearing either very good news or very bad news. "Michael, Sarah, we need to talk," he said. "The whole community needs to talk." What followed was one of the most humbling experiences of Sarah's life. Their neighbors, many struggling with their own financial challenges, had organized a coordinated response to the Thompson family's crisis. The envelope Pastor Williams carried contained $23,000 in cash, checks, and money orders, contributions from over 200 families, businesses, and organizations throughout their county. "This represents everything from a widow's Social Security check to the Methodist Church's building fund," Pastor Williams explained. "Nobody gave what they couldn't afford, but everybody gave something." Jake's football coach, a burly man named Tom Peterson, stepped forward with his own envelope. "The team held a talent show and charged admission. The boys raised $800. Jake doesn't know. We wanted it to be a surprise." More surprises followed. The local John Deere dealership had agreed to defer payments on their equipment loans for 6 months. The grain elevator would advance them money against next year's projected crop. 3 neighboring farmers had volunteered to help plant in the spring, donating their time and equipment to ensure the Thompsons didn't lose another growing season. But the most significant surprise came from an unexpected source. As the crowd of neighbors began to disperse, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. The man who emerged was tall and well-dressed, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making important decisions. "Excuse me, are you Michael Thompson?" he asked, approaching the family with purposeful strides. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" "My name is Robert Thompson. I believe I'm your brother." The silence that followed this announcement was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of the oak trees around their house. Michael stared at the stranger who claimed to be family, searching his face for familiar features. There was something in the man's eyes, a particular shade of blue that Michael recognized from old photographs of his father. "That's impossible," Michael said finally. "I don't have a brother." "You do," Robert replied quietly. "I'm 3 years older than you." I left home when you were 17, right after Dad's funeral. I was angry and stupid and thought I could make it on my own. By the time I came to my senses and wanted to come back, too much time had passed. I was too proud to admit I'd made a mistake. Martha Thompson had emerged from the house during this conversation, drawn by the commotion in the driveway. When she saw Robert, her knees buckled and she had to grab the porch railing for support. "Bobby?" she whispered. "Oh my God, Bobby, is that really you?" The reunion that followed was awkward and emotional and complicated by decades of hurt feelings and missed opportunities. Robert had become a successful attorney in Chicago, specializing in insurance litigation. He'd been following his family's situation from a distance, hiring private investigators to keep track of their lives without revealing his own existence. "I've been sending anonymous donations," he admitted. "The church didn't know where some of their contributions were coming from. I've been trying to help without interfering, but when I heard about the foreclosure, I knew I had to come forward." Robert's offer was straightforward. He would pay off their medical bills and bring their mortgage current in exchange for becoming a partner in the farm operation. He wanted to invest in renewable energy projects, wind turbines and solar installations that could provide steady income while allowing them to continue farming. "I made my money fighting insurance companies that deny legitimate claims," he explained. "I know how to beat them at their own game. Your case isn't hopeless, it's just complicated. With proper legal representation, we can probably recover most of your medical expenses." The insurance battle that Robert launched on their behalf was swift and decisive. Armed with decades of experience and unlimited resources for expert witnesses, he filed suit against the insurance company for bad faith denial of coverage. Within weeks, he'd secured a settlement that covered 85% of Michael's medical bills and established a precedent for other families facing similar situations, but the financial rescue was only part of Robert's gift to his family. His return had broken a pattern of isolation and secrecy that had plagued the Thompson men for generations. For the first time, Michael had someone who understood the weight of their father's legacy, someone who'd also struggled with the impossible standard of stoic self-reliance that had nearly destroyed them both. "Dad never talked about the war," Robert explained during one of their long conversations. "But he didn't have to. You could see it in the way he jumped at sudden noises, the way he stared off into nothing sometimes. He was carrying wounds we couldn't see, and he taught us to carry ours the same way." These revelations helped Michael understand that his reluctance to seek medical care hadn't been about strength. It had been about fear. Fear of appearing weak, fear of burdening others, fear of admitting that he needed help to survive. His father's war had created a legacy of silence that had nearly claimed another generation. The community's response to their crisis had revealed something equally important: that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but an acknowledgement of connection. Their neighbors hadn't contributed money out of pity, but out of recognition that community meant taking care of each other during difficult times. Jake watched his family's transformation with the wisdom of someone who'd been forced to grow up quickly. He saw his father learning to accept help without shame, his mother rediscovering hope after months of despair, and his grandmother finally sharing stories she'd kept locked away for decades. "You know what I think Grandpa would say about all this?" Jake asked one evening as the family sat around the kitchen table, planning their future with Robert's help. "What's that, son?" Michael replied. "I think he'd say that some battles are worth fighting and some victories take generations to achieve. Isn't that what he wrote in his letter?" Michael smiled, recognizing his own words reflected back at him by his son. The boy was right. Their victory wasn't just about saving the farm or beating the insurance company. It was about breaking a cycle of silence and isolation that had started in a Vietnamese jungle 50 years earlier. For the first time in months, Michael Thompson allowed himself to believe that their story might have a happy ending after all. The tragedy struck on a bitter December morning when hope had finally begun to feel real again. Michael had been making steady progress in his recovery. The insurance settlement was moving forward, and Robert's renewable energy plans were bringing new possibilities to their struggling farm. Jake had even started talking about college again, his grades slowly improving as the family crisis stabilized. Sarah woke that Tuesday to find Michael's side of the bed empty and cold. She assumed he'd risen early to check on the livestock, as had become his habit since returning to light farm work. But when she looked out the kitchen window while making coffee, she saw him collapsed in the snow beside the barn, his body motionless against the white ground. The ambulance ride to Mercy General felt like a cruel repetition of their October nightmare, but this time the stakes felt impossibly higher. Michael was conscious, but barely responsive, his speech slurred and his left arm hanging limp at his side. Dr. Wilson met them in the emergency department with the grim efficiency of someone delivering news she'd hoped never to give. "He's had a stroke," she announced without preamble, "a significant one, affecting the right side of his brain. We're taking him for emergency imaging to determine the extent of the damage." The CT scan revealed what Sarah had feared. A massive blood clot had formed in Michael's brain, likely caused by complications from his previous infections and surgeries. The prolonged stress on his cardiovascular system, combined with medications he'd been taking for pain management, had created the perfect conditions for disaster. "The clot is extensive," Dr. Wilson explained to the family gathered in the consultation room. "We can attempt emergency surgery to remove it, but I need you to understand the risks. Even if we're successful, there's a high probability of permanent neurological damage. Without surgery, he won't survive the next 24 hours. Sarah signed the consent forms with hands that shook so violently she could barely hold the pen. Jake stood beside her, his 17-year-old face bearing the weight of adult terror. Robert paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his legal training useless against medical realities that couldn't be negotiated or appealed. Martha sat in a wheelchair they'd brought from the nursing home where she'd been staying since her own health had declined during the family crisis. At 80 years old, she was watching her son fight for his life while grappling with the possibility that she might outlive her own child. The surgery lasted 7 hours. 7 hours during which Sarah alternated between frantic prayer and cold calculation of what their life would look like if Michael survived but remained severely disabled. The medical bills would multiply exponentially. Their insurance, which had been reluctantly cooperating under Robert's legal pressure, might find new ways to deny coverage for long-term care. The farm, barely saved from foreclosure, could still be lost to medical bankruptcy. But these practical concerns felt insignificant compared to the devastating possibility that Michael might never again be the man who had taught Jake to drive a tractor, who had held her through countless difficulties, who had finally learned to accept help from others just when it seemed too late to matter. Dr. Wilson emerged from surgery looking exhausted and cautiously optimistic. "We were able to remove the clot," she announced. "His vital signs are stable, but the next 72 hours will be critical. The brain tissue that was deprived of oxygen may not recover fully. We won't know the extent of permanent damage until he regains consciousness." Michael remained in a medically induced coma for 5 days while his brain attempted to heal from the trauma. During this time, Sarah rarely left his bedside, surviving on hospital cafeteria coffee and the sandwiches that neighbors continued to bring despite their own winter hardships. She read to him from farming journals and local newspapers, hoping that familiar voices and topics might somehow reach through the medical machinery keeping him alive. Jake's response to his father's stroke was to throw himself into adult responsibilities with frightening intensity. He negotiated with the bank for another extension on their mortgage payments, explaining their situation with a maturity that left loan officers speechless. He arranged for neighbors to handle the daily care of their livestock and coordinated with Robert's renewable energy contractors to ensure the solar panel installation could proceed even without Michael's direct involvement. Most heartbreakingly, Jake began preparing for the possibility that he might need to become the family's primary breadwinner. He researched GED programs that would allow him to graduate early and looked into agricultural management courses at the community college. His college football dreams, which had been slowly reviving, were quietly set aside in favor of more immediate practical concerns. Robert watched his nephew's premature transition to adulthood with the recognition of someone who had faced similar circumstances at a young age. He remembered his own father's struggles with war-related disabilities, the way family crises had forced him to become self-reliant before he was emotionally ready. The pattern was repeating itself with devastating precision. "You don't have to carry this alone," Robert told Jake during one of their late-night conversations in the hospital waiting room. "I made that mistake when I was your age, and it cost me 20 years with my family." "Someone has to take care of things," Jake replied with the stubborn determination that marked him as unmistakably a Thompson. "Dad would do it for me." "Your dad is going to recover," Robert said, though he wasn't certain he believed it himself. "And when he does, he's going to want to find you living your own life, not sacrificing your future for his present." When Michael finally regained consciousness on the 6th day, his first word was Jake. His speech was slurred, and his left side remained partially paralyzed, but his eyes were alert and focused on his son's face. The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it left her physically weak. The extent of Michael's impairment became clear over the following weeks. His left arm and leg had limited mobility, requiring physical therapy that might or might not restore full function. His speech was affected, forcing him to work harder to find words that had once come naturally. Most challenging of all, his short-term memory had been compromised, making it difficult for him to follow complex conversations or remember recent events. But Michael's essential personality remained intact. He was still stubborn, still proud, and still determined to maintain his independence despite obvious limitations. The difference was that his recent experiences had taught him to accept help without viewing it as personal failure. The financial implications of his stroke were staggering. The emergency surgery alone cost $75,000. The extended hospital stay added another $45,000. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy would require months of intensive treatment. Even with Robert's legal victories against their insurance company, the family faced the prospect of additional debt that dwarfed their previous medical bills. Sarah found herself making calculations that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. If Michael never regained full mobility, they would need to modify their home for wheelchair accessibility. If his cognitive impairment was permanent, he might never again be able to manage the complex decisions required for farming. The renewable energy project that had seemed like salvation might instead become an overwhelming burden for a family dealing with disability. Jake's college prospects, which had been slowly recovering, were dealt another devastating blow. No scholarship offer could justify the luxury of higher education when his family's survival remained uncertain. His response was to quietly withdraw his applications and begin researching distance learning programs that would allow him to earn a degree while remaining at home to help with his father's care. The community's response to this second crisis was more subdued than their reaction to Michael's initial illness. People were dealing with their own winter hardships, and there was an unspoken recognition that the Thompson family's problems had moved beyond what neighborly assistance could reasonably address. The casseroles and cards continued, but the larger fundraising efforts had been exhausted by previous emergencies. Martha Thompson, whose own health had been declining throughout her son's various crises, suffered what appeared to be a minor heart attack on the day Michael was scheduled to come home from the hospital. At 80 years old, she was experiencing the particular anguish of watching her family struggle with problems she felt responsible for creating but was powerless to solve. As February snow began falling on the Thompson farm, Sarah stood at her kitchen window and wondered if they had reached the limit of what any family could reasonably be expected to endure. Michael was alive but changed. Jake was sacrificing his future for their present, and the financial pressures continued mounting despite every effort to address them. The lump that had started everything had been removed, but its legacy of medical complications and financial devastation continued to ripple through their lives like stones thrown into still water. Sarah found herself questioning whether survival was the same thing as victory, and whether their family would ever again know the simple security they had once taken for granted. The revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or sudden insight, but through a yellowed envelope that Martha Thompson had hidden in her bedroom closet for 37 years. On a gray March morning, as Sarah helped her pack belongings for the move to assisted living, Martha's trembling fingers pulled out a manila envelope marked, "For Michael, when he's ready." "I should have given him this years ago," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind rattling the farmhouse windows. "But I was afraid of what it would do to him, afraid of how angry he'd be." Inside the envelope were documents that reframed everything the Thompson family thought they knew about their struggles. Medical records from the Veterans Administration dating back to 1973 showed that Michael's father had been part of an experimental treatment program for veterans with embedded shrapnel. The program, designed to help fragments work their way out of the body naturally, had documented side effects that included potential transfer of metallic particles during reproduction. More shocking was a legal settlement agreement from 1975, 3 years after Michael's birth. The VA had quietly paid Michael's parents $150,000 to avoid a lawsuit after medical examinations confirmed that shrapnel fragments had somehow been present in Michael's tissue from birth. The money had been placed in a trust fund, earning interest for over 40 years, waiting for Michael to claim it once he learned the truth about his condition. Sarah stared at the bank statements showing the trust fund's current value, $1.2 million. The money that could have saved their farm, paid for Michael's medical treatment, and secured Jake's education had been sitting in an account that Michael never knew existed. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell him?" Martha's response came through tears that had been building for decades. "Because his father made me promise never to tell him about the money unless he was dying. He said he didn't want Michael to feel like damaged goods, didn't want him to think he was owed something because of the war. He wanted Michael to make his own way in the world." The irony was devastating. Michael's father, traumatized by his war experiences and determined to protect his son from feeling like a victim, had unknowingly condemned his family to financial ruin when the very condition he'd tried to hide finally manifested itself 50 years later. Robert Thompson's legal expertise proved invaluable in navigating the complex process of claiming the trust fund. The VA had maintained meticulous records, and within 6 weeks, Michael found himself in possession of enough money to pay all their medical bills, save the farm, and secure his family's future for generations. But the financial windfall came with emotional complications that money couldn't resolve. Michael's stroke had affected his ability to process complex information, making it difficult for him to fully understand the magnitude of what his father had done. In his clearer moments, he struggled with feelings of betrayal and grief, mourning not just the father he'd lost, but the years of unnecessary hardship his family had endured. "He thought he was protecting me," Michael said during one of his speech therapy sessions, the words coming slowly and deliberately. "But he was wrong. Some secrets hurt more than truth." Jake's reaction to the revelation was more complicated. At 17, he was old enough to understand the crushing weight of his grandfather's decision, but young enough to feel anger at the adults who had shaped his life without his knowledge. The college applications he'd withdrawn could be resubmitted, the football scholarships reconsidered, but the months of stress and premature responsibility had changed him in ways that money couldn't undo. "I'm not angry about the money," he told his Uncle Robert during one of their walks around the farm. "I'm angry that Grandpa thought we weren't strong enough to handle the truth. I'm angry that Dad almost died because no one would talk about what was really happening." The discovery of the trust fund also revealed the extent to which their community's support had been both necessary and transformative. The neighbors who had contributed to fundraising efforts, the church members who had organized benefit dinners, the strangers who had donated to online campaigns, all had responded to a crisis that could have been avoided if family secrets hadn't taken precedence over practical communication. Pastor Williams helped the family navigate the ethical complexities of their situation. Should they return the community donations now that they had access to substantial funds? How could they honor the generosity of people who had sacrificed for their benefit without making those people feel foolish for their efforts? The solution they arrived at reflected the Thompson family's fundamental values. They established a charitable fund using a portion of the trust money, dedicated to helping other rural families facing medical crises. The community members who had supported them became the fund's first board of directors, ensuring that their generosity would continue helping others long after the Thompson crisis had passed. Dr. Wilson played a crucial role in unraveling the medical mystery that had consumed so much of their lives. Armed with the VA documents and her own extensive research, she was able to explain how shrapnel fragments could theoretically be transferred from father to child during conception, though such cases were extraordinarily rare. "Your father's medical records show that the shrapnel was located very close to his reproductive organs," she explained to Michael and Sarah during a consultation. "The fragments were small enough and positioned in such a way that cellular transfer during reproduction was possible, though the mechanism isn't fully understood even today." More importantly, Dr. Wilson's analysis of Michael's case led to new protocols for treating veterans with embedded foreign objects. The Thompson family's ordeal, documented in medical journals and VA bulletins, would help prevent similar tragedies for other military families. The insurance company that had initially denied Michael's claims found itself facing a federal investigation after Robert's legal team revealed the pattern of denying coverage to veterans' families. The settlement they eventually agreed to not only covered all of the Thompson family's expenses, but also established new guidelines for processing claims related to service-connected conditions. Michael's recovery from his stroke was slower than anyone had hoped, but more complete than doctors had initially predicted. Physical therapy helped him regain most of the mobility in his left arm and leg, though he would always walk with a slight limp. Speech therapy improved his ability to communicate, though he continued to struggle with complex concepts and had to work harder to find the right words. The most significant change was in Michael's relationship with vulnerability. The man who had once viewed asking for help as a personal failure had learned to accept assistance as a normal part of human existence. He hired farm workers when he needed them, consulted with specialists about his medical care, and most importantly, talked openly with his family about his fears and limitations. "I spent 50 years trying to be the man I thought my father wanted me to be," he told Sarah one evening as they sat on their porch watching Jake practice driving the tractor in the distance. "Strong, silent, self-sufficient, but that man almost killed me and nearly destroyed our family." Sarah's transformation was equally profound. The woman who had spent months terrified of financial ruin and medical catastrophe had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She returned to nursing full-time, specializing in rural healthcare advocacy and helping other families navigate medical crises. The skills she'd developed fighting insurance companies and coordinating community support became valuable assets in her professional life. Jake's path forward remained complicated by the months of stress and responsibility he'd shouldered during his family's crisis. The college scholarships that had seemed lost were indeed recoverable, but he found himself questioning whether traditional academic success was what he really wanted. The experience of helping save his family's farm had awakened an interest in agricultural business and renewable energy that felt more meaningful than his previous dreams of playing college football. Robert's reintegration into the Thompson family proceeded gradually, marked by both genuine reconciliation and moments of awkwardness as they navigated decades of separation. His financial support and legal expertise had been crucial to their survival, but rebuilding emotional connections required time and patience from everyone involved. The renewable energy project that Robert had initiated proved to be even more successful than anticipated. The solar panels and wind turbines not only provided steady income for the farm, but also served as a model for other rural families looking to diversify their revenue streams. Jake found himself increasingly involved in the technical aspects of the project, discovering an aptitude for engineering that suggested new possibilities for his future. Martha Thompson's move to assisted living was made easier by the knowledge that her son's family was finally secure. At 80 years old, she was learning to forgive herself for the decisions she'd made decades earlier, understanding that fear and good intentions could sometimes lead to devastating consequences. The VA Trust Fund revelation had also uncovered other veterans' families dealing with similar situations. Support groups formed, legal precedents were established, and medical research was initiated to better understand the long-term effects of foreign objects in veterans' bodies. The Thompson family's private tragedy had become a catalyst for systemic change that would benefit thousands of other families. As spring returned to the Kansas countryside, the Thompson farm looked much as it had a year earlier, but everything had fundamentally changed. The financial pressures that had once threatened to destroy them were gone, replaced by the security that came from honest communication and mutual support. The family secrets that had poisoned 3 generations were finally exposed to sunlight, where they could be examined, understood, and ultimately forgiven. Michael stood in the same barn where he'd once hidden his growing lump from his family, but now he was surrounded by the voices of people working together toward common goals. The silence that had nearly killed him had been replaced by the complicated, sometimes difficult, but ultimately healing sound of a family that had learned to tell each other the truth. 18 months after that terrifying morning when Michael collapsed in the barn, the Thompson family gathered on their front porch for Thanksgiving dinner, their table expanded to accommodate the extended family that had emerged from years of separation and silence. The November air carried the scent of Martha's cornbread dressing and the sound of children's laughter as Jake's girlfriend Emma helped set places for the largest family gathering in the farm's history. Michael sat at the head of the table, his left hand still slightly weaker than his right, but steady enough to carve the turkey that Robert had driven down from Chicago to share with them. The scar on his back had faded to a thin white line, barely visible beneath the flannel shirt that Sarah had given him for his 54th birthday. His speech had returned to near normal, though he still paused occasionally to find the right word, a small reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. "Before we eat," Michael said, rising carefully from his chair, "I want to say something to all of you." The table fell quiet. Jake, now a freshman at Kansas State University studying agricultural engineering, looked up from his conversation with his cousin David, Robert's son, who had driven down with his father for the holiday. Sarah reached for Michael's hand, a gesture that had become natural after months of helping him navigate his recovery. "A year and a half ago, I was too proud to admit I needed help," Michael began, his voice steady and clear. "I thought being a man meant suffering in silence, carrying burdens alone, protecting my family by pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Martha Thompson, now 81 and requiring a walker but insisting on attending dinner at the farmhouse rather than the assisted living facility, nodded slowly. The guilt she'd carried for decades had gradually transformed into something closer to peace, though the regret would always remain. "That pride nearly killed me," Michael continued. "It nearly destroyed our farm, nearly cost Jake his future, and nearly broke the woman I love most in this world. But it also taught us something important about what family really means." He gestured toward the assembled group. Sarah and Jake, Robert and his family visiting from Chicago, Martha in her wheelchair at the foot of the table, Dr. Wilson and her husband who had become close friends during the long months of recovery, Pastor Williams and his wife representing the community that had rallied to support them, and Emma, the young woman who had stood by Jake through the most difficult period of his young life. "Family isn't just blood," Michael said. "It's the people who show up when everything falls apart. It's the neighbors who organize fundraisers when you're too proud to ask for help. It's the brother who comes home after 20 years because he knows you need him, even if you're too stubborn to say so." Robert Thompson wiped his eyes with his napkin, still adjusting to emotions he'd spent decades suppressing. His own journey back to family had been complicated by years of successful independence, but watching his brother nearly die had reminded him that professional success meant nothing without people to share it with. "The shrapnel that almost killed me was a gift from my father," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "Not the metal itself, but the lesson it taught us about the cost of keeping secrets. Dad thought he was protecting me by hiding the truth about his war, about the money the VA had set aside, about the medical risks I might face. But secrets don't protect people. They isolate them." Jake stood up from his place at the table, moving to stand beside his father. At 18, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced adult responsibilities and discovered he was stronger than he'd known. His football scholarship to Kansas State had been supplemented by an academic grant for his essay about rural healthcare advocacy, a piece that had grown out of his family's experience. "Dad, can I say something?" Jake asked. Michael nodded, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. "When you got sick, I thought my job was to take care of everything myself," Jake said, addressing the table. "I thought that's what men in our family did. We handled problems alone. We didn't ask for help. We didn't show weakness. But I learned something different." He looked around the table at the faces that had become his extended family. "I learned that real strength comes from building connections with people who care about you. The money Grandpa left behind could have solved our problems years ago, but it wouldn't have taught us what we learned about community, about asking for help, about letting people love you even when you're not perfect." Dr. Wilson raised her glass of apple cider. "To the Thompson family," she said, "for teaching the rest of us that healing happens in community." The toast was echoed around the table, but Michael wasn't finished speaking. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket to pull out a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter my father wrote to me before I was born, a letter I only read 8 months ago. Martha kept it hidden because she thought it would hurt me to know how worried he was about the war's effects on his family." He unfolded the yellowed paper carefully. He wrote, "I pray that my war won't become his war, that the metal in my body won't somehow find its way into his. But if it does, I want him to know that he's stronger than I am. I want him to know that some battles are worth fighting, and some victories take generations to achieve." Michael looked around the table at the faces of people who had fought alongside him in ways his father never could have imagined. Dad was right about the battles and the victories, but he was wrong about one thing. I'm not stronger than he was. We're stronger than he was. Together. Sarah Thompson rose from her chair and moved to stand beside her husband and son. The woman who had spent months terrified of medical bills and foreclosure notices now managed the charitable foundation they had established to help other rural families facing health crises. The foundation had already assisted 43 families across Kansas and Missouri, turning their personal tragedy into a resource for others. "Your father would be proud," she said, looking directly at Michael. "Not because you suffered in silence, but because you learned to speak up. Not because you carried your burdens alone, but because you let us help carry them." As the family finally sat down to their Thanksgiving meal, the conversation flowed naturally between updates on the renewable energy project that was now providing income for 6 neighboring farms, Jake's studies in agricultural engineering, Robert's plans to relocate his law practice to Kansas, and Martha's surprisingly popular memoir about military families, which she was writing with the help of a ghostwriter from the local college. The empty chair they had set for Michael's father held his Purple Heart and a small American flag, but the sadness that had once surrounded his memory had been replaced by understanding. His war had indeed become his son's war, but it had also become his family's victory, not through silence and isolation, but through the radical act of letting people help. As the afternoon sun slanted through the farmhouse windows, illuminating 4 generations gathered around a table that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph, Michael Thompson realized that the lump on his back had been both the worst thing that had ever happened to his family and the best. It had nearly destroyed them, but in the end, it had taught them the most important lesson of all, that love shared is stronger than pride preserved, and that some victories are only possible when you're brave enough to admit you can't win alone. The war was finally over. The healing could continue for generations to come. Michael Thompson's story reminds us that the greatest battles we face in our later years aren't always the ones we can see coming. Like so many of us who grew up believing that real strength meant suffering in silence, Michael nearly lost everything because he was too proud to ask for help when that mysterious lump appeared on his back. His father's war wounds, hidden for decades, had literally been passed down through generations, but so had the dangerous belief that admitting vulnerability was somehow a sign of failure. The truth is, the bravest thing any of us can do is reach out when we're struggling, whether it's a health concern we've been ignoring, financial worries we're carrying alone, or family secrets that have been eating away at us for years. Michael's family discovered that their greatest strength came not from individual endurance, but from letting their community help carry the load. When we share our burdens with our children, our neighbors, our doctors, our faith communities, we don't become weaker. We become part of something stronger than any of us could ever be alone. The healing that matters most happens when we finally stop pretending we have all the answers. Have you ever avoided seeking help for something important because you didn't want to burden others? What family stories or health concerns have you been carrying in silence that might benefit from sharing with someone you trust?